First of all, thanks a lot to Benoit for the kind invitation and basically to the whole organization team as well for inviting me here today to talk a bit about that's not working. That's working. To talk a bit about AI and specifically the use of AI also in the social sciences and specifically the computational social sciences. And before I go into it, maybe first question to the audience. Um, who thinks AI is good for reproducibility? All right. Okay, few hands. And who thinks AI is bad for reproducibility? Yeah, all right. Okay, good. Few people didn't show their hands. We have probably to discuss that a bit later on. But yeah, just to highlight what I'm also trying to talk a bit about is basically how, AI actually can be very bad for reproducibility and what AI can also help us in making reproducibility easier. So there are certain ways of doing that. I'm a computer scientist, which, just to emphasize that, so I try to talk a bit about the good and bad things computer science brings also to the social sciences. So let's talk a bit in the beginning. Well, we know that social science research has been changing a lot, right? So specifically with the arrival of or the availability of lots of data and specifically human data as shown in that Nature paper, we have seen lots of new research questions being enabled by those kind of data sets. And at the same time, technically a whole new research field that's computational social science or web science and related areas that came out of that. And that, of course, comes with specific methods and specific data. And for the purpose of the talk today, what I'd like to focus on specifically is something we at GESIS, quite a few GESIS people here, tend to call digital behavioral data. So it's basically what's called human data on that Nature cover page. And so specifically data such as online discourse, for instance, as it appears in social media or online news. Activity streams, as you can find them, for instance, on social web platforms like shares, likes, follows, and the like. Web search behavior, so how people interact with search engines, browse, navigate, but also these very kind of low-level behavioral traces like scrolling, mouse movements, even EEG data, gaze behavior, and the like. So that's the kind of stuff we are very interested in. And what is specific about the data is that it's generally very close to the users and also to their personal information. And so that's also one feature that makes it sometimes tricky to deal with. That's a slide that some people may have seen in the past. It comes out pretty much every year that basically shows what happens on the web in 1 minute, right? And so this is just to illustrate that data is not only sensitive, but data is also very large and very big. So we see that, there are 360,000 posts on X, 6.3 million Google searches, 41 million WhatsApp messages. More recently, ChatGPT prompts, of course, have become quite popular and not taking up the same kind of scale. But just to highlight, that's large volumes of data and very heterogeneous data as well. And when we look at methods, right? So there, of course, new kinds of data require new kinds of methods as well. And people use, in order to analyze that kind of data, very different kind of things. So very basic statistical methods that have been around for a long time, for instance, for time series or network analysis, but also, and that's what for the purpose of the talk today, I'm going to refer to as AI, basically these kind of things, right? So very basic tailored machine learning methods or models that have been trained from scratch, what people have been doing since many, many years, but also, and more specifically, of course, pre-trained language models, where we talk about small-scale things such as BERT, but also proprietary large-scale models such as ChatGPT and GPT and the like. And what is important about all those methods is that they, substantially vary with respect to the scalability, robustness, for instance, how well they are able to deal with biases in the data or noise in the data, efficiency, transparency, interpretability, and one aspect, as I've mentioned in the beginning, I'm particularly interested in is reproducibility as well. So people have been using those kind of AI methods for quite some time now, and there are many things that are currently quite popular in research and in social science research as well, which to some extent go a bit beyond just taking, let's say, a machine learning model or language model to annotate data or to use it as part of your data science pipeline, right? So one example is, for instance, using AI for simulating human behavior, right? So that's a very active field of research in the last 3 years or so, where people try to understand how well, for instance, responses from large language models could be used to actually simulate human behavior. Like in that case here, you have a prompt, for instance, like a question from a specific survey. In that case, that's a question about gun laws and gun regulation and the correlation with crime and violence. You get some certain probabilities for certain answers back, and then you can compare that to the opinion distributions in a traditional survey. So that's been done in quite a few papers. In that case, in that paper, some Northern American surveys. So that's, of course, very nice. And those things look, or the kind of responses you get look very neat and very easy to use and very plausible. The problem we have with those kind of approaches is that, of course, models have very inherent biases, right? So if you look, for instance, at that plot, what the authors did was comparing model responses. So basically each column in that table corresponds to a specific large language model, and they analyze to what extent those model responses correlate with different respondent demographics. And in that case here, that example, that's about income. I hope it's visible in the back, maybe not that well, but basically what the plot is showing, or the table is showing, that there are certain models. So white means actually higher correlation. It's a bit confusing in that plot. Usually it's the other way around. I didn't make it, just an excuse. And what they find is that there are certain models that correlate a lot with low income groups, and there are certain models that have a bias towards high income groups, and that is not even consistent behavior. So that kind of behavior may differ for each model for very different kind of questions, topics, and the like. So this is just to highlight that there are inherent biases that are also very intransparent, right? So we do not know much where these biases come from, and people have also been using trying to use personas a lot in order to steer model responses in the direction of a specific demographic, right? So basically telling the model, pretend to be, I don't know, 18-year-old, highly educated, low-income person or something. And that's also quite interesting. And in that plot, you see basically on the x-axis the default subgroup representativeness, and you see on the y-axis the steered subgroup representativeness based on the personas. And so basically, if the dots, the data points, are above the line, then basically the model was steered towards the specific user demographics. And you see that, of course, it seems to be true for most of the models, right? So steering models helps to a certain extent, but it's only up to a certain extent. So you do not fully get things that correlate 100%, of course, and it's very hard to understand where or to what extent those kind of responses actually are representative. So some key challenges that I think derive out of that is that, I mean, language models are biased. The provenance of model responses is very hard to understand, because you basically have intransparent models where to some extent it's very hard to say why a model is giving a response. And at the same time, you have data that often is also very intransparent and sometimes not even accessible. So you have two layers, what makes it very hard to interpret this kind of responses. And to that extent, I would actually say that large language models are not a very good choice when representativity and provenance of the actual model responses really matters a lot. And at the same time, access to data is very crucial. So if we want to understand why models behave in a certain way, of course, we have to understand the data and also have to access or have to have access to the data. At the same time, we may want to train our own models because then it's easier to understand why a model is doing what it's doing. And the third option is still, of course, to mine, for instance, opinions or attitudes directly from the data rather than from large language models that to some extent are very opaque boxes, black boxes that are very hard to make sense of. So then, we have some researchers or AI startups that go even a bit beyond trying to replace survey respondents, but actually say we can even replace researchers, right? So that's, I think, a very interesting paper that came out or was accepted this year at ACL. So ACL is sort of the top tier natural language processing or AI conference, and it's been written, let's put that in air quotes, by an AI startup called Intology, if I'm not mistaken. And soon after the paper got accepted, they put out a blog post saying that that paper was not just written by a large language model or something, but basically the whole scientific process of identifying research gaps, surveying literature, identifying and defining experiments, conducting experiments, and actually writing the paper would have been done by the large language model. And right, so there was actually a sentence saying, well, the AI was leading the paper. We only did very minor polishing and formatting of the final version. And I went to the conference because luckily we also had a paper there. I was very much looking forward to the presentation and the debate around that paper, but it never happened because the paper got retracted or withdrawn. It's hard to say. I think reasons are very obvious, right? I mean, if it's actually true, what's written there, there would be plenty of questions that needed to be asked and lots of ethical problems with that. And at the same time, I wouldn't take those kind of claims very seriously because it's been basically an AI startup probably looking for venture capital. But, and I think that's quite interesting, is that there actually is a real wave of very interesting papers that try to investigate and try to understand to what extent models actually can do that. They usually never come to the conclusion that the model or model X is the best choice for identifying research gaps or whatnot, but they at least try to do sober research that helps us a better understanding to what extent models can do those kind of things. And that brings me to the question, can models, from your point of view, at some point actually replace researchers? So my postdoc said when he, or one of my postdocs said when he was reading the blog post, that now we can actually all go to the beach, which would be nice, of course. But so any opinions, thoughts, nods, head shaking? Yeah. Maybe research assistants. Yeah, I think, that sounds realistic. And I think to some extent we already have those. I mean, there's so many very useful tools around already that could be actually dubbed research assistants. So I would say we're still very far away from actually replacing researchers and going to the beach. But of course, AI can be very useful in order to support certain steps in the life cycle. But claiming that those models would take full control of all these steps seems to me a very unrealistic and overhyped claim. So let's get a bit more back down to earth and look at the research data cycle, because research assistants would probably have to support different steps in the research data cycle. That's the GIS's version of the research data cycle, but those kind of figures, I think, are well known pretty much in all disciplines and all organizations. Simply summarizing that, of course, there are different steps like collecting data, finding data, processing and analyzing data, or archiving and sharing data that you have to go through when you want to do science to some extent. And I think one very important point about that research data cycle is that, of course, as part of each of these steps, we have many different kinds of artifacts that each have interdependencies. So we have, for instance, data sets, publications, code, scripts, machine learning models, other kind of methods that may be involved in the step. And in each of those steps, there may be different relationships that may be very important. So very typical questions we as researchers ask ourselves a lot are, for instance, which publication cite which data or method. So when I want to find, for instance, authoritative state-of-the-art data sets or methods for a specific problem, what claims are supported or rejected by what data set or publication, which data was used to train or evaluate a certain method, or specifically when it comes to, for instance, machine learning methods. And I would argue that answering those questions has become much, much harder due to the large scale or widespread adoption of specifically AI-based models in all kinds of steps already. And that impacts reproducibility a lot, as we also want to see. And when we look at reproducibility and replicability and all these kind of concepts, I think it's also very important to mention that, and that's also a point I try to make if I get as far, that it's not only reproducibility and replicability, but specifically when it comes to machine learning methods and deep learning based methods, concepts like generalizability, for instance, are much more important or give us a much better understanding of, or are basically another kind of concept or kind of requirement we have to achieve so that you can basically trust that if you apply similar models or methods on different data sets that represent the same kind of problem, you actually get kind of similar results so that basically the models generalize also across different kind of data sets. And you may ask, what is the situation in computer science and AI with respect to reproducibility? So let's first say that reproducibility crisis is a term, I think, that's been highly debated in pretty much all disciplines in many years. And there's studies that say that 90% of researchers across disciplines actually say that we do have a reproducibility crisis, and I would agree. In computer science, a kind of naive approach to computer science may assume that the experimental apparatus in computer science is basically some kind of compute environment, so something that basically is a piece of hardware that puts out zeros and ones, and that to some extent these are much, much easier to control variables because we don't have humans that may be moody or may affect certain studies, like in the social sciences or psychology. We don't depend with our experiments, like in physics, for instance, on temperature or humidity or all these kind of things. And it may actually be much, much easier to reproduce computer science papers, but that's, of course, entirely wrong and is actually a very, kind of worrying situation. So there are many reproducibility studies around in computer science since many years. Some, for instance, found that only about 60% of papers can be successfully replicated. But the most worrying part here is that there are several studies that show if you try to replicate or reproduce computer science experiments just by looking at the paper without asking questions to the authors, getting further clarifications, this kind of reproducibility number drops down to 4%. And so this is, I think, very worrying and shows us that there is some kind of reporting problem when it comes to computer science, and that to some extent methods seem to be underspecified in computer science papers a lot. And that has also turned to the more negative even more with the attention towards deep learning approaches, right? So there are papers already since many years ago when we were more talking about deep learning rather than large language models, and that showed that even if you contact authors and follow a very sophisticated protocol, if you take publications, deep learning papers from top tier computer science venues, really the best of the best A-star core conferences where all of us want to publish, only 38% of these models can actually be reproduced. So this is, of course, to some extent very worrying. And to some extent is also part of the fact that, models get bigger and more intransparent. So I think that's part of the reason. So in that plot, we basically see how a parameter count, so model size, correlates with model performance on many, many different benchmarks. I think it's sort of a well-known fact these days. And we also see that, for instance, in computation and social science, people tend to adopt those kind of larger models more and more. So that's a plot we've been generating by looking at all publications from the ICWSM conference series, which is quite popular for computation and social science researchers. And we see that basically with the arrival of BERT, one of the first larger language models, people have been starting to use that a lot, and it has become a very kind of default option. While with the arrival of more powerful and capable commercial proprietary models, people are using that as well to a very large extent. So now I've mentioned generalizability before, so let's explain a bit why generalizability is so important when it comes to AI models, and that's an example that is not coming from the social sciences, but is actually concerned with detecting COVID from X-ray pictures. So there were people who claimed that they trained a computer vision model uh, based on X-ray pictures of COVID patients, and claiming that simply from those X-ray pictures they could, with a very decent accuracy, predict whether a patient has COVID. And medical experts were very surprised because they couldn't do that, but the model could. And so that paper got cited a lot, and there was a replication study coming out a tiny bit later where people took the very same images, but removed the body parts from those images. So that's pretty much what I did. It may have not looked exactly like that, but maybe a bit of an exaggeration. But basically, they removed all meaningful parts of those pictures. And what happened is that they achieved sort of comparable performance on those pictures that were very meaningless. And this is a very nice example of something we call shortcut learning, right? So that what happened basically in that experiment is probably that when the authors of the first paper generated that data set, they probably took X-ray pictures from different hospitals, one with COVID patients, the other one not with COVID patients. So that means those X-rays probably came from different X-ray machines, meaning the kind of shades of gray those X-ray machines produced were slightly bit different. And that's exactly what the model learned, right? So the model didn't learn anything about detecting COVID. The model simply learned to distinguish those different shades of gray. And this is a prime example of shortcut learning. It shows us that, of course, if you apply those kind of models to some other kind of data set, you would get sort of zero kind of performance. It would not work because the model wouldn't generalize to other data of the same problem. And for those reasons, generalizability is something that's as important as reproducibility, and something that's very much overlooked a lot with in computer science literature. And that brings me, I'm still at the introduction, I'm a bit worried. Uh, that brings me to what I want to say about basically a summary saying that of course there are plenty of reasons why AI contributes to some kind of reproducibility crisis, and some of them are listed here, right? So we have much more complex and codependent methods that depend on models, depend on data, and vice versa, and it's pretty much a big mess. And transparency is very hard in those kind of situations. In many cases, we don't even have access to the data because the data is also commercial. We have those problems that I've mentioned about shortcut learning and generalizability that also make it very, very hard to actually trust the kind of results that we as computer scientists claim in our papers. And I think that's a very fundamental issue as well. All right, and that brings me to the second part, and I try to be a bit quicker than I was planning to in order to get through that, where I try to show a bit what are the kind of things that we are working on in order to address specifically those kind of reproducibility and quality issues, starting with data access, right? So how can we actually make data more available so that people can train their own models or analyze the data itself? what we can do about that reporting problem, right? So that's a problem we see in many different disciplines as well. And how can we empower researchers to find state-of-the-art methods? So basically how to address this kind of, I call it state-of-the-art crisis, because right now it's near impossible for a PhD student to simply identify what really is the state-of-the-art method on a specific problem. So let's start with data access. And data access, of course, also has many problems. I hope I come to the solutions as well at some point, which is that we are pretty much dependent on third-party gatekeepers, right? So many of you may have heard that Twitter shut down the APIs at some point, and Twitter has been one of the, or if not the most important data source for many people working on web science or computational science questions for many, many years. And that shutdown of those APIs people use to get the data and work with the data, I think was a very nice warning sign that, of course, relying on those third-party gatekeepers to give us access to their data is a very risky business. And in that example also, it's not just the fact that right now we can't get access to new data, it's also that what researchers did in millions of papers probably was sharing data sets that only contain tweet IDs in order to comply with Twitter's regulations, and people had to rehydrate and basically repopulate those data sets themselves using those very APIs. And all of those data sets basically are at least not very easily rehydratable and useful and reproducible in the future. And that is, of course, a very big problem. We also see it, so that's a piece of work done by specifically Temo, who's sitting here, looking a bit into tweet deletion and how much or what percentage of tweets actually get deleted over time in different kind of samples, from which we know that, of course, data on the web, not just on Twitter, but everywhere decays over time, and we actually have to also tackle those problems. And it's also the case that data evolves over time, and data evolution also impacts the quality and reproducibility of our own models and methods. So if you look, for instance, at that paper here, in that heat map, you see the kind of differences between the vocabulary in Twitter between 2013 and 2019. And you basically see that the further away you go from a respective year, the darker it gets. So basically the difference in vocabulary is much, much higher, which is sort of obvious, but many people tend to forget that if they use a specific language model that's trained on a specific corpus, it will not be aware of specific vocabulary and terms and terminology people have been using in subsequent years as well. And that's also one kind of fact that is very important to keep in mind, that we need to have continuous access to that data, because otherwise not only the data decays, but also our models are going to decay over time. And lastly, as I said in the beginning, behavioral web data is also very sensitive. So that's probably impossible to read in the back. That is an excerpt of for me, prime example of how sensitive web data actually is, which is a publicly released data set of, I think, 20 million search queries published by AOL. Some people may still remember AOL. And so they basically said, well, let's publish some data for research purposes. And of course, everything has been anonymized, so people thought it's safe to be used. It, of course, contains lots of stuff people don't want to share with the public about themselves, right? So people basically Googling about skin mold and fungi. There are more, how do you say, more sensitive examples, which I didn't dare to show right now. And what happened very quickly was that after a few days, the first researchers came and basically showed that they could de-anonymize some of the data in the corpus. And IOL had basically to withdraw that corpus. Since then, we've never seen anyone publishing web search queries at such a scale anymore. So people are very cautious about these things. But I think it's a very nice reminder of the fact that full 100% risk-free anonymization of data is technically impossible. So there are always risks as soon as you have larger volumes of data. You can minimize them, but there are always risks. And yeah, that's technically what we are working on with many colleagues at GESUS right now. So how to better and more responsibly create large archives of web data, specifically social web data. So this is some piece of work I'm going to talk a bit more about in detail. And we are basically trying to establish very large archives of different kind of platform-based data, for instance, coming from Twitter, Telegram, Blue Sky, also stuff that's not related to social media, like fact-check claims that are distributed on the web and the like. Let's give a very brief idea on how we do that, right? So that's a figure or a plot that actually shows how we have been harvesting 1% of Twitter for roughly 10 years, right? So each of these lines basically represents one server running in a specific time period. The x-axis is basically the time period, and you see that we have lots of different machines running in order to be able to also harvest that data continuously, because you always have to make sure that there are no that there are actually redundancies, because even if you have redundant servers on one location, locations may have network outages and so on. So we basically had lots of crawls coming from different locations, people and organizations contributing to that. And what we did was taking all that data and generating one complete, and to the best of my knowledge, that's the only complete corpus like that, one complete 1% sample from the entirety of Twitter between 2030 and 2023. And of course, as I said, that kind of data is also very sensitive. So there are many legal and ethical and licensing constraints we're also facing in order to make that kind of data available. And those are topics we are working on right now in order to make that data more accessible and useful to others. So there are two different kind of options that we are currently looking into. One is secure data access. So how can we actually facilitate researchers to work with that data without taking it away from us, so basically taking it to their own machines. The second one is how can we generate public non-sensitive data offers that do not carry any risks of sensitive information and so on, but still are actually useful for research purposes. So this is one slide showing an example on how we do exactly the latter. So how we actually generate derivatives from data that people can use for their own research purposes. And it's to some extent, of course, also AI-based. So we use AI-based models and specifically NLP methods in order to annotate a given social media post, like for instance, that one from Trump, with specific pieces of information, for instance, that this is about COVID-19 vaccines, about COVID as well. So the Wikipedia references basically that there's a certain kind of emotionality in that post. To some extent, we also established the georeferences. So where is that post coming from? And the key idea is that we do that for very large volumes of data, that even without publishing the full text, which is legally not possible due to licensing constraints, people can understand which entities, organizations, topics have been mentioned in what tweets over time, with what kind of sentiment connections. So for instance, we have one corpus, this TweetsKB corpus, that's containing 3 billion tweets annotated like that. So you get the metadata, when it was published, the shares, the likes, plus all of that kind of information. And that facilitates all kinds of social science research. So that's, for instance, a plot where we use exactly that corpus together with political science and communication studies experts to investigate vaccine hesitancy in the German-speaking countries, which has been surprisingly high. And our assumption was that the discourse we find on the web is a very big reason for that. And where you see that, of course, in that data, you can perfectly see those kind of correlations with society events, like, for instance, suspension of certain COVID vaccines. And we do the same with other kind of corpora. Just to say very quickly that Telegram is one of those data sources we started to look into more recently, where obtaining that kind of data is even harder because there's no API we could use in order to investigate that data. And the very first question most people ask themselves when they work with Telegram data is, what kind of channels are actually out there that are meaningful and useful for the kind of research questions I have. And that's because there is no registry of channels or something. We actually have to discover them. And that's what we did. So we started with some 300 seed lists or 300 seeds of channels, Telegram channels. We started crawling those messages and looking for other channel pointers in those messages. And with that approach, we actually discovered roughly 1.2 million channels over time. So you can see that that plateaus to some extent after a while, meaning that there's either a chance we sort of already crawled the entirety of Telegram, or we are stuck in some kind of subgraph of Telegram. That's something we try to figure out right now. And for the public channels in that corpus, we also crawled all the messages, basically generated a large corpus of 120 million Telegram messages that we are currently also trying to make available for research purposes as well. So I have some more examples about fact checks, but I think if I go through all of that, I'm not going to get to the end of my talk. So just to say, we also do many other kind of data sources that you may be interested in. Just go to the web data website that leads you to, or catch me later on. I'm happy to talk about these things. Let's come to the second problem, which was the kind of reporting problem I've mentioned in the beginning about computer science and specifically AI papers. And that's what ChatGPT thinks and scientific publication looks like. And I think it's not too incorrect. And it sort of illustrates that, I mean, since a very long time, the primary output of or the primary documentation of scientific output is still basically these kind of very unstructured scientific publications. And within those publications, there are many things that are very hard to make sense of and very hard to interpret, right? So there are things like unsupported claims that may be hard to address because it may be also a kind of incentive and kind of incentive related problem. But there are many things that actually could easily be done better and could be addressed in a certain way, like very informal citations of data sets or computational methods. So people don't use DOIs or persistent identifiers to make those things very understood consistently. You may find broken citations, specifically when it comes to web pages. That's a very typical kind of pattern. You may find very ambiguous descriptions of data sets and method adoption, specifically when it comes to machine learning related things, or where you don't know, for instance, to what extent a certain machine learning model was trained on a specific data set, what were the training and test splits, very specific kind of issues you have in that regard as well. And those things are very frequent issues we see in papers. So then that's a piece of work again from my nice colleagues from GISIS, who actually started doing a survey asking social scientists what are the key challenges preventing them from having more reproducible papers as well. And they're, I think, not very surprising results in the sense of lack of time, lack of incentive and rewards. I think we all know that. Insufficient funding, but also things like lack of training and knowledge and lack of guides and checklists. And that's also mirrored in the responses to the question of what are the kind of things that would help us in order to produce more reproducible research, where sort of, again, many people were saying things like step-by-step guides, a clear definition of standards, examples, and best practices. So to some extent, it actually seems to be a case of not fully comprehending in many cases what are the key problems and how to make it better. And for those reasons, what we have been doing is generating checklists and guidelines that are meant to guide people to better make the data methods reproducible and more understandable. And that's also in computer science, one of those ways or approaches most of the top tier AI conferences have been implementing in the past years. The very rigorous checklists and basically papers that don't comply with those checklists get desk rejected. But as I've said, we also have many other problems beyond reproducibility that don't prevent that things may sometimes be a bit fishy. So that's basically the first part where we were looking into how could we facilitate, basically, or empower researchers to produce more understandable and reproducible papers in the first place. But we also already have millions of papers where we have to try to make sense of. And that's another kind of line of work we are working a lot on, which is how can we develop NLP/AI-based models that help us in mining very large volumes of papers for instance, information about what is a data set that's used here, what is the task that's addressed in that paper. So that's actually a paragraph or a sentence coming out of a ICWSM paper. And we try to develop models that help us in better tagging the important bits like tasks, data sets, machine learning models, what machine learning model architecture people have been using, the kind of relationships between data sets and tasks and models and the like. And we are doing that, for instance, by annotating in a very large effort publications ourselves, right? So we have created a corpus with 54,000 mentions of any of those entity types. And we fine-tuned large language models to automatically detect those things, and we applied those afterwards to a very large corpora right now, basically to pretty much most of the available open access publications in computer science, but also to corpora like ICWSM, for instance. And um, this is where you see the performance of those kind of models, right? So there you see, so basically each column corresponds to one model. Each row is basically a specific type of information we are looking at. And you see that for certain things like data set, for instance, over here, it's already working quite decently. But there are other things that are much, much harder to make sense of. In many cases, those kind of poor performances in the automatic extraction or annotation corresponds also to a poor inter-rater agreement of the annotators, meaning those concepts are very hard to understand even by humans. And that's why models perform or can only perform very poorly on those things. Right, and this is an excerpt of what we get out of that model, right? So when we, for instance, run such a model on the entirety of papers published at ICWSM over the years, we get it's still very noisy, so we still work on cleaning up those things, but you already get a nice list of tasks and methods people have been working on. I'm not going too much into detail here. And you can already very nicely understand, for instance, the citations of machine learning models over time. So that's the plot I've been showing in the beginning. I actually see how people adopted certain kinds of machine learning and large language models at ICWSM and what role they actually play. And you can also look into, for instance, the kind of data sources people are using. As I said, Twitter has been the most dominant, and I think that's sort of representative also for other fields working with that kind of data. But people have also been looking into very different kind of data sources. And that drop you see here in 2023, I guess if we would now continue that plot, it would probably go down dramatically because people don't have access to the data anymore. Right, and that's about data sets and models. Another kind of artifact or resource that's very important when it comes to reproducibility is actually software, right? So people use software in their papers as part of their methods, and we have to make sense of that. And this is another example where you look at that blue line here. That's basically a sentence coming out of a paper where people use R, talk a bit about the version they have been applying, and so on. And we are working similarly to the approach I've been showing before, creating models that are able to detect, well, that this is a citation or a mention of R, that this is basically a mention that says that we have been using. So this is a usage of a specific piece of software, that there's a reference further to support that piece of software, that there's a version number being provided and all that kind of information to basically automatically mine that kind of information. Similarly to the approach I've been showing before, we've been training large language models in order to help us, annotating the corpus, training a large language model in order to do that task automatically. And with that, we can also understand how people actually adopt software over time. So that's basically a plot based on the PubMed corpus, where we took 3.5 million publications, ran those models on those publications, and we see that what kind of software environments people have been using. Yeah, there's SPSS, exactly, still very popular. And things like Python, picking up speed and so on. And so you can basically analyze entire research communities with those kind of tools and better understand how software is being used. If you look into the different subfields that you find in PubMed publications and you look at how often you find software citations in their publications, you see that sort of naturally the kind of subfields that have a higher percentage of software adoption usually are the ones that have something like computing in the title as well, or about mathematics and so on, right? And funnily enough, and sort of correlating to what I said before about the problems we have in computer science, the very same top adopters of software are also the ones who have the poorest software citation habits, right? So here we have been looking into citation completeness, to what extent, for instance, these citations contain version numbers or the developer of the software and so on. And it's sort of the case that specifically the more computing-oriented disciplines or fields usually have worse citation habits there as well. And last but not least, just to say, we are not only developing those kind of things ourselves, but we're also working with the community. We publish those data corpora, encourage other people to develop their own models and make those things that are still, of course, far from being perfect, much better in the future as well. That brings me to the last part, and I think I should manage to get to the end as well, which is how can we empower researchers to find state-of-the-art methods, so to basically address this kind of state-of-the-art crisis, as I've mentioned in the beginning. And for that, let's look a bit at how researchers currently find state-of-the-art methods for a given task. So let's say for a specific data set, specific data type, and a specific problem, I need to find certain methods. And what many people are doing is surveying literature. So what have other people used in order to address that problem? Due to the problems I've mentioned on the previous part, this is still a very challenging task, right? Because not many people have access to these automated mining models, and doing that manually can sometimes be very, very time consuming. We also have things like code and model repositories like GitHub or Hugging Face, where people often look. But here the problem is you don't have a connection with the research context. You don't know in what kind of research tasks, research problems people actually have been using those kind of things. And what we see a lot in many disciplines is that people use what they know. So what is available to them and what they already have a bit of experience with. And that's, of course, very natural. In computer science, what usually we try to do is, in order to identify what is a good method or bad method, we try to do something called benchmarking. So basically developing standard evaluation corpora, define certain metrics according to which we measure what the performance is. And due to those reasons, those kind of benchmark corpora have huge power, because once a benchmark corpus is out there, people start using it, and you will find thousands of papers. It becomes basically a well-accepted habit to say, I'm testing my model on that benchmark corpus, and if I'm better than the previous model on that benchmark corpus, then I'm state of the art and I get that paper published. And that's why those benchmarking corpora have a very huge importance in computer science and AI these days. And these benchmark corpora are very often flawed and have significant problems. Here's one example of more closely related to computational social science, which is about Twitter bot detection. So if, for instance, I want to analyze a tweet corpus, maybe as a first pre-processing step, I may want to eliminate data coming from bots rather than humans. So it's a task people have been working on for a long time. And what you see here is basically different kind of benchmark corpora that were published and very heavily cited and used in many different papers. And you see performance some researchers achieved with very basic, very simple heuristics and very simple decision trees. So that's here. And here you see how much worse or better those very simple heuristics and decision trees were compared to very complex deep learning based or large language model based models. And you see that the difference is actually very negligible. So there are many methods that perform, even with very simple heuristics and decision trees, very close to what very complex AI-based models do. And that's basically the main reason, because you have very simple shortcuts in those data sets. So these are two very basic decision trees for two of these data sets. So the two left ones are for that one. The one on the right is for the lower one. So there you can see, if you look at the right example here, it's basically simply asking, was the account created after November 27? If yes, does it follow more than 500 accounts? And if yes, that was a bot. And that is, of course, not a realistic heuristic you could apply in order to detect bots. Similarly, like the other one basically had bot accounts that were not talking about earthquakes, but humans did, which is also very odd, right? And so you find these very odd artifacts that simply are remainders of the kind of data set construction process people have been using. I could now talk for ages why those things appear, but rather than doing that, I'd just like to say those kind of shortcuts you basically find in many, many benchmark data sets for lots of different problems. And of course, models trained on those kind of data sets are never going to perform well on real world Twitter data, for instance. So these are takeaways from that example, right? So benchmark data sets often don't represent actual real world data set problems. We have very limited generalizability coming out of that, right? So if you basically develop a model and train it on those kind of corpora, you're never going to perform well on real world data. And the big question is how to establish better benchmarking practices. And that's also one of those things we are working on right now. So basically trying to better evaluate actual generalizability of models. So that's a different problem here. Another very established problem that there are many benchmark data sets out there, which is called argument mining in social media posts. So basically trying to understand to what extent a specific post contains an argument or not. And also here we basically have up to 100 probably well-established benchmark corpora people have been using in order to evaluate their models and train their models and basically say that state of the art. These are some examples of arguments and not arguments, which we could also debate for a long time. But just to say that there are lots of data sets out there, and what we are doing is, for instance, evaluating to what extent models, state-of-the-art models trained on one data set actually perform when tested on another argument mining data set. So each row and each column corresponds to a data set. You see that the diagonal, so basically trained on one data set and tested on the same, or the distribution, the same data distribution, you get sort of darker, meaning better performance. But as soon as you move to the left or to the right and you basically test on another argument mining data set, performance in many cases drops to around randomness, right? So roughly 50%, sometimes a bit better, sometimes a bit less, meaning that even though we have a very active research community publishing those papers for many, many years, those models actually don't really generalize. And so they don't actually learn to detect arguments. And this is one of those things we are working on a lot, trying to establish those kind of evaluation protocols that emphasize generalizability. So we also run, for instance, shared tasks, AI tasks, where we propose new corpora that in an ideal world don't contain these shortcuts, or where these shortcuts are so diverse that they don't matter anymore. And where we encourage people to have better benchmarking and evaluation practices to really be able to understand the state of the art. And that brings me to the last bit I want to say, which is, how can we also find AI methods specifically in the social sciences, and how can we as GESIS, for instance, develop infrastructures that help people in better finding methods that are reproducible, that generalize, and that are well documented. And that is an effort, again, with some of our nice colleagues sitting over here. who are developing something called the Methods Hub, which basically, for those who know Hugging Face, it's something like a Hugging Face for social scientists, and where we basically focus on empowering social scientists, even without technical expertise, to find and use methods for very different purposes. So it's basically methods that we curate ourselves, partially we develop ourselves, but where we also acquire methods from the community, and where we focus specifically also on providing documentation, tutorials, giving insights about, for instance, benchmarking results, about the provenance of the models themselves, where we try to ensure citability of those methods. So if you, for instance, publish your method here, like with established dataset portals, you get a DOI, and your method gets persistently archived, so that you can actually ensure that those methods are citable and persistently available for the future as well. So that's, I think, a very nice initiative. And in case anyone wants to learn more about that, our GISIS colleagues, that's the Methods Hub team, and there's one more part of the Methods Hub team in the back. They're running a session on Friday where you can learn a bit more about how to use the Methods Hub and what it actually is. And I really encourage everyone to participate. And with that, I'd like to come to the wrap up, because I think it's been lots of content, and it deserves a very, very short wrap up to summarize what the main points were, right? And as I said in the beginning, one of the key issues when it comes to reproducibility and quality and research, specifically research using computational methods, is data access. And that's why in the beginning, I've been talking specifically about ways on how to make research data, even at large scale, more available to the research community using, for instance, non-sensitive data corpora, and looking also into the kind of legal challenges that are involved with those kind of data sets. The second problem we identified was the reporting quality, right? So how can we better incentivize researchers in order to have better reporting habits? And but also, how can we use AI in order to mine already existing publications to better understand what kind of methods were actually used in those papers? And the last part was specifically about how can we curate and document high quality methods for the research community, and how can we establish better benchmarking practices that focus on generalizability as one of the crucial concepts of AI-based methods, and how can we engage the community in order to adopt these kind of more sound and solid evaluation practices as well. And I believe that requires to some extent a culture change, because those issues, I think, are very critical and make me also very worried. And I think it also requires lots of interdisciplinary collaboration. And for those reasons, I think it's very nice that we are all here in such an interdisciplinary setting talking about those habits. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening. And I also like to thank all these nice people. I apologize to all the nice people who are not on the picture, because it's not a very recent one. But of course, the work I've been talking about was not only mine, but there were many, many people at GESIS and HHU who contributed to that. And with that, thank you for listening.